topic. It's a topic that we're seeing come up with much higher frequency. Basically, the idea is if someone who is not a citizen or resident of the United States is thinking of coming in, we keep seeing time and time again individuals sending their kids to school here or having relatives move to the States. They get a taste of the life in the United States, and they're just, absolutely ready to pull the trigger during their first visit. Unfortunately, a lot of times that's exactly what they do. But so instead of doing that, there's some great tax planning that can be done if we can catch it before they actually become U.S. persons. And the idea is we do pre-immigration planning. We bring in the foreign individual and the family under a really tight tax plan. So let's go to the agenda, the next slide. It covers a lot of different areas of tax law, so we're going to kind of talk through a lot of, most of the major points. If you have any questions, you can just push the question button, and Tony will relay the question to us. And we'll, of course, immediately address it. It's no problem. We can stop. We encourage the questions. They kind of break up the presentation to some extent. With respect to the agenda, we'll go through kind of what are the general rules of estate tax. Most of the people online, it looks like we have a lot of CPAs online. You're obviously going to have a good background in general of what the estate tax is, what's the gift tax. How does that change with respect to an individual who is not a resident or a citizen? And then, there's a transition. Okay, when someone's not a resident or citizen, well, what do they need to do with respect to becoming a resident or citizen? Not on the immigration side, although there's an interplay of both income and estate tax and immigration law. This is really we're going to deal with mostly today estate issues, and then there's an issue there's an income tax issue that relates directly to the estate tax issue with respect to moving assets outside the U.S. And that's kind of the whole thing. We'll also hit on some once people are here. A lot of times, what happens is you can imagine someone, even if they're wealthy, really isn't going to be all that excited about moving control or assets or even partial control of most of what they have on Earth before they come into the States. So there will almost always be a maintenance of quite a few assets coming in, and oftentimes that amount of assets, that value, will exceed the unified credit or whatever they have left of the unified credit. And we'll go through a few very common and successful domestic strategies as well. The reason we came up with the presentation, actually, we've written a lot about it, both on the pre-immigration and the expatriation, that's U.S. people leaving. There's a lot of relationship, actually, between the two. We've never really seen it written out or talked about completely, the whole process, in a seminar. So what would probably take us 4 days to go through on a highly detailed analysis, we're going to work through some of the major issues. So if these issues come up, you see that someone's coming in, you'll know who to call. The next slide is the introduction, which basically is just the idea of let's avoid bringing someone's assets into the estate tax net. We're going to work through how you actually may end up with a U.S. trust. You may start with foreign, you may do foreign gifts, you may have a whole program of removing assets from the U.S. estate and gift tax. But after you come in, you may actually move things into a domestic format without incurring or impacting that exempt status,
That
that
is true.
estate tax status. So think of it kind of as a process whereby, everyone's looking for, well, what's your, general format? Well, we don't really have a exact process for every single person, which is why it's a little complicated. But what we're going to work through today are the commonalities. And from the commonalities, which apply to almost everybody, then it becomes the customized process. So when we do that, we're removing from the estate tax net, we're reducing the taxable estate by doing that, and then we're going to have this issue of, okay, I'm coming into the States, I'm very wealthy, but I really want to retain some assets, and I need this much income. I can't be relying on my kids to get the income. The next slide is
just an overview of the U.S. estate and gift tax. Under current law, it's $11.7 million each per individual for a U.S. resident, and that is subject to change. There's discussions that could change, but right now that's what the law is, and until it changes, that's what we're going to say.
Yeah, in 22, we can expect a substantial decrease in unified credit, right?
Right. It's been proposed by the current administration in Washington, and it's very likely that it'll pass. So just keep that in mind. The other proposal that is related to this is the step up in basis. They're talking about it being removed as well. So that could be a double whammy.
It's a major change. And as part of that 11.7 or whatever it becomes, even though it may fall substantially, one of the backdrop issues is how do I get into a situation where I can utilize that, and how do I decrease if I have someone, we have a client that's very wealthy, how do I decrease what I have outside the U.S. before I have to utilize it?
Because, a lot of times, there's different ways to plan, and as Gary already said, it's always tailored to the client, because there's a certain way to plan if they're willing to wait 5 years, and there's other types of planning when they want to come in right now. They can't wait.
Which is like
almost everybody.
You rarely have. Yeah. You just rarely have. Sometimes we have, for instance, we have some medical groups outside the country that can wait because they really don't need to establish an intent to be in the States forever for many years. They need to visit, and they may be, keep in mind, the client may be a tax resident for income tax purposes, for U.S. income tax purposes. That doesn't mean they're a tax resident for estate tax purposes.
The tests are different because there are two sections of the code. One is Subtitle A and one Subtitle B. And so it's important, though, because once an individual obtains their residency start date, at that point they cast the net over the entire world. All those assets you haven't planned for is pulled in, and that can be a substantial effect, especially if these changes occur and the exemptions are much lower and there's no step up in basis. So it's very important that that individuals who are planning to come here, they plan to avoid this for their worldwide assets that aren't inside the United States.
Exactly. So you have this on the next slide, determining U.S. state tax status. What's your status?
Right. No, it depends. There are different definitions in the code depending on what tax regime is in effect. On the income tax side, it's usually based on your residency with a green card or a citizenship or substantial presence test. Those are the main tests that are utilized to show are you a U.S. income tax resident or not.
Right.
And it's important that once a person has a green card, even if they leave outside the United States and they live somewhere else, until they relinquish that green card, they're still a U.S. income tax payer.
There's this terror that comes over clients regarding the cocktail party rule, which is not spending more than 120 days in the U.S. When we describe how the estate tax residency requirements work, it's very uncommon that a client will come in and understand that if the intent is to stay in the States, they are now a U.S. estate tax victim.
Right.
It doesn't matter, this cocktail party rule, the substantial presence test, the green card, none of that really has a lot of significance with respect to the estate tax. Now that can be a tremendous advantage as well, because we can segregate the planning, the income and the estate tax planning. But there's a huge educational aspect with respect to someone, on the pre-immigration side. They're not going to understand it. We almost always insist upon us doing an overview, a roadmap of what they have in mind, because they can start on a step-by-step plan to remove the assets and then bring in only what's needed under the exemption amount. What we're going to get into on the next slide?
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that for U.S. transfer taxes, this idea of domicile, that is the test, and it's physical presence and intent to remain. It's both.
Mm-hmm.
And as Gary said, it can be a great planning option as well, depending on the nature of the client and where the assets are.
And that's right. It's a great planning option. Also, the issue of clarity is unbelievably important. There's a number of cases, IRS cases, federal cases, that deal with, when the person died or when the person made the gift, were they a resident? So the cases are 40, 50, 60 pages long, because what happens is the courts work through all of these esoteric factors, like he had an apartment in Manhattan and he liked it a lot. You know what I mean?
He's part of this club.
Yeah, like because it all comes down to, what was in his brain? What was the intent with respect to remain in the U.S., to stay there? And it becomes this ridiculous fact-finding mission. Whereas if you take a strategy and you to reduce tax, and you initially don't want to be a resident because you want all of these worldwide assets to be moved out of your taxable estate, and then later you may want to become a resident because you get the exemption amount. Non-residents don't, as we'll get to in a slide or two here. I thought it was the next slide, but it's not.
Yeah.
It's in 2 slides or something.
Yeah.
And so the idea is get rid of the assets while you're out. You don't intend to stay. And then when you come in, you want to have, almost all the clients want a block of assets in their name or an entity controlled by them. And use the credit, use the exemption amount through domestic planning. What's the next slide?
The next slide is just a broad overview of just taxation in general. With the income tax, obviously all U.S. persons are subject to the U.S. income tax on a worldwide basis. That's important because once a non-resident, non-citizen obtains a green card, at that point all their worldwide income will be taxed. And then for the estate tax, we've already talked about domicile. I know this is some background, but just understand that the same applies. Once they're domiciled here, then all their worldwide assets are exposed to the U.S. estate tax and gift tax. And at times, sometimes there's treaties, which we'll talk later, but at other times they won't apply. So it's important to understand where these things are and to have a roadmap before you come in, so you're not caught in these bad situations. And then lastly, we've already talked about the $11.7 million exemption amount. Under current law, it's indexed to inflation. If it doesn't change, it will go up again, but that's unlikely based on what we're hearing out of Washington. So on the next slide, just some more basic rules. If you have 2 U.S. citizen spouses, there's an unlimited deduction in the gifting between them. And that's important. That can be utilized at times if someone's going to expatriate. if one's going to stay in the United States or stay a U.S. citizen. And then now with the portability, you basically don't pay estate tax until the last to die. So you're able to defer it. You don't have to divide assets up anymore like you used to, and it's great. But that's only for those who are U.S. citizens.
So if husband and wife are going to come in and become residents and citizens, there are all these advantages: the exemption, the gifts between spouses, the domestic planning we can do. The idea is that what's limited in terms of their domestic planning, the remainder is moved out of the estate before they come in.
And that would be generally non-U.S. assets. So assets outside of the United States would be utilized for the planning. Okay, so that's on the next slide. It's important because the rules that affect non-residents, non-citizens, you have to have an understanding of how those apply before you come here and the difference between the two. But basically, as relates to the estate tax, it's U.S. side assets. So if a non-resident, non-citizen owns, like real estate's the most common one in the United States, and it's not in a foreign entity, and they die, you have a problem.
That just has to do with initial planning to begin with.
Right.
I mean, no non-resident, non-citizen should be buying property or opening a brokerage account in basically a U.S. entity. If they want to use a U.S. entity, they can, but that really has to be owned by a foreign entity. Eventually, the foreign entity has to own everything. What happens is it's an exception to the rule of the state tax in that the foreign entity does not die. So they create a foreign entity. But generally it has to be a C corporation. You can maybe use partnership, but it's a little risky in terms of the tax status. But if they haven't done that planning, that needs to get done. Sometimes on the real estate side, it can be a hassle because once you have not done that planning on the real estate side, you have to go through the FERPTA process. But if someone's out of the country and they own significant property here, they have to do it through a foreign entity, generally taxed as a corporation.
And now, and the reason why it's important is because the last thing you want for a non-resident, non-citizen to own something individually in this country when they die, because the credit amount is $60,000.
Yeah, it's a $13,000 credit, shields $60,000 in assets. We had an issue where husband and wife came in and bought a mansion and didn't think anything of it. We actually represented the son, which was interesting, that the parents didn't come in for any advice at all. And they bought this huge property, and mom died. They were older. It was a surprise, but she died. And instead of just having an absolute, what they call the nothing burger, nothing would happen if that had been owned in a foreign entity. So it was worth like $6 million, and there's no husband and wife transfer. There's no liberty with that. There's no freedom in that like you have if you're residents or citizens of the United States. So you don't get a complete deduction for gifts to the spouse, and upon the death of the spouse, there's no portability, nothing. So she dies, and you had tax on half the value of the home. You're talking about $3 million.
Yeah.
$1.2 million tax bill for absolutely no reason. So you'll find a lot of times there was no initial planning, and only the U.S. stuff is subject to the estate and gift when they're non-resident, non-citizen. So what we typically look at is saying, okay, you've got all this stuff in the rest of the world. Let's focus on that before you become a resident or a citizen to get that out, and then we don't have to deal with it at all ever again when you come in.
And it's also interesting, the nuance between the tax laws, at least on the transfer tax side, is the difference in treatment of an intangible that's owned by a non-resident, non-citizen during a lifetime, they're able to gift those, no issue at all during their life. You do not want them to die with it.
Yeah, that's a throwback from an old rule where the U.S. encouraged trading of stocks and bonds by foreign people. And it's a lucky break a lot of times too, if someone opened an account in their own name, because typically that would be a U.S. asset subject to all these problems on the state and gift. If you can catch it, the intangibles are not subject to the gift tax, so you can move the intangible outside the states, outside the U.S. estate and gift tax net to a foreign entity without any problem. You can gift it out.
The other unique thing, and we'll talk about it, I think, a tad bit later, is on the income tax side as well. There's also a benefit for a non-resident, non-citizen with the sale of U.S. stock.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. No capital gains. Exactly.
So, and on the next slide, it goes through, it talks about intangible, the assets that are exempt, and it goes through and we kind of define what those might be. But it's important that those assets are accounted for, especially ones obviously that are U.S. situs. There's a lot of planning that can take place both on the income tax and the gift tax side during their life, but if they die with it individually, it's a problem.
Right. So that's kind of what we do for a non-resident alien, that we're dealing with, that's not coming in. If they're coming in, we try to get that stuff that's outside the country out of the estate, and then we kind of prepare for the entrance.
So on the next slide, I'll let Gary talk about this. It's his specialty, treaties.
Well, I don't think we're going to spend a huge amount of time on treaties, but the idea is all of these rules associated with income, estate, and gift tax can be altered substantially by treaties. There are situs treaties, which basically say, okay, we're dealing with two countries. You have to be a resident of one of the two countries in general. So it's going to be U.S. and whatever country you may be a resident of. We do so much South American work. There's basically no treaties in South America, so it's not an issue. But there's a treaty in almost every European country. There's a lot of Asia treaties. But the rules in terms of the hit you may take in terms of a gift or an estate tax issue, you may be able to get a break through a treaty if you're a resident of one of the other countries. You have to be careful because the changed rule may relate back to a definition, for instance, on these situs issues. So a situs treaty means that the asset, wherever the asset is, that country has situs, and that country may tax that asset, right? You have to worry about definition. It's a careful analysis because, for instance, with corporate stock, which is a very common international asset, the U.S. says U.S. corporations formed in the U.S. are U.S. situs. Whereas many other countries, including treaty partners, say, no, the stock certificate, the location of the stock certificate is the situs of the stock. So now when we go back and say, someone died with stock, which is, like Brian said, it's kind of stupid because you can put it in a foreign entity. But someone dies with stock and they want to take a treaty position. And they say, you know what, I want it to be of Japanese jurisdiction because the taxes, there's no tax if the stock's in the Japanese situs. And the U.S. says, well, hold on. That's nice that Japan says that situs is where the certificate is because that's, where the certificate was when the decedent died, but that's a U.S. stock. That's a U.S. company. So there's a dispute as to situs. All of these things have to be taken into consideration. An easier format, honestly, and that's the trend over the last decade, it has to do with residency. it's a domicile-based treaty. And a domicile-based treaty says, it's more of a blanket, and it says, wherever the decedent was domiciled, that jurisdiction will tax the gift and estate. And the other country, maybe the country of citizenship, will not. You can get into a definition of domicile, which, I mean, you wouldn't believe these arguments and stuff, but that's less likely. Domicile is typically the contact with that country, the residency, and the intent to stay. And typically, if you land under a domicile treaty, it's easier to rely on. We have on the next slide some of the estate and gift tax treaties. We have cited and domicile. It's very technical, but it's something to keep in mind, especially for the CPAs out there. You may have an answer that's negative. There may be a taxation issue that you can't work around, for instance. Sometimes we have that. Well, there may be a treaty. The treaty may resolve it or partially resolve, reduce the rate. And it's definitely, you have to look at it every time. The next slide we go back to, now we're going to get into the actual process of gifting while you're a non-resident alien. We, like Brian said, we would focus on foreign assets, because gifting of the U.S. assets, if not, if you didn't do this foreign entity and that owns the assets, is going to create a gift tax, and there's basically no unified credit, right? Apart from with intangibles are for
negligible,
free. Yeah, are for free. Did you want to expand on that?
No, just basically, from the perspective to emphasize is just that even though I know a lot of times in clients they want to be here like yesterday, it's so important that an analysis be done and planning take place, because once they obtain their residency start date and they're here, that's it. I mean, you can expatriate, sure, but they probably don't want to do that. They just got here. So it's important that this is all taken into account, and that this easy planning, if you plan it, there's so many ways to avoid these issues. And a lot of times we're always on the back end. We see the issues after it's occurred, because they've come here, they're here, and then somebody dies.
They call it the triage plan.
The triage plan, that's right, that's right. We're moving the stretchers around in here. So it's just, that's the big thing. And again, being the NRA, all the worldwide assets, there's no jurisdiction yet if you gift them. And so there's different strategies to gift. It can be direct gifts to family members. It can be through a foreign trust. There's all these things that they're able to do, but a lot of times people don't do it. And it's frustrating for us, because the option and the ability to do it is there. It's just not taken advantage of.
Well, a lot of times they just went ahead with whatever they wanted to do. It wasn't. I don't think it was a question of they didn't do it because they were bucking the system. They just kind of did, what they were intending on doing, and they became a resident, and it's a mess.
And the other thing is, it's just they just need to be aware that the rules for the U.S. estate and gift are different than for the U.S. income, and that we'll discuss a little bit later when it comes to planning. Even though something might work for the U.S. estate and gift to get things out, they have to be careful, especially if they utilize a foreign trust to get those foreign assets out of our tax net. There's an income tax component that a lot of individuals aren't aware of that can cause the issues later, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit.
We basically can move into the next slide, which is a technical vehicle we use a lot of times. So if you have a highly wealthy person who is contemplating the immigration, wants to create a plan, a lot of times there are children involved, and they don't want to make a direct gift out to the children, and a lot of times, of course, the children are coming into the States, so we don't want to bring that in either. So we use a foreign trust, and we, on this initial slide, it says non-U.S. persons. We say non-U.S. persons because foreign trusts are treated as non-U.S. persons in general. You have the income tax side on this initial slide. It's just what you CPAs are used to when you have non-domiciled, non-U.S. income individuals. It's very similar treatment for the foreign trust. The treaties do apply. Any income is subject to the 30% FDAPI. That's the 30% flat tax on passive income. There's an election they can make with respect to real estate to take deductions. It's a graduated rate issue. Did you have any to add to that? It's like a foreigner.
I mean, yeah, basically it's just like a non-resident, non-citizen, but with some certain exceptions. And it's important to note as well, being a foreign trust, and it's respected that way for income taxes, then if there's as long as the income is not U.S. based, then there's no issue from the U.S. income tax side for the foreign trust. And U.S. beneficiaries are only taxed on things when they receive it from the foreign trust on the the K-1s that they would get.
Yeah, and it's usually a pretty seamless transition, this first step, where we gift out assets worldwide into a foreign trust, a fraction or a large fraction or all, or however the client wants to do it or feels comfortable. Basically, that's the first step. Let's move out the foreign assets. And then we get into the idea of, okay, when are we going to come in? How are we going to come in? And then, do we have U.S. beneficiaries with respect to this foreign trust or not? Because we're going to get into a very complicated area associated with a deemed redistribution of that gift into those trusts and what that means from an expatriation of assets standpoint.
Right. Because the way that when all of these rules over time have been overlaid on top of each other for different reasons, and so we have a lot of things here to where while something is effective to get assets outside of the estate tax net before you come in, the income tax side and Subtitle A is still there. And it's important because the creation and the funding of a foreign trust is all about timing and who the individuals are when things take place. And this is especially true for a non-resident, non-citizen planning to come in, because if they create a foreign trust and they come in within 5 years of creation, which is almost everybody who does this, IRC 684 would generally apply, unless there's an exception, which we'll talk about, which is basically it's as if they're deemed to have transferred the assets on the date they receive residency. And that's important because any U.S. person that makes a gift to a foreign trust, it's as if basically you have expatriated that asset outside of the income tax base. And so there is a deemed sale based on the fair market value of those assets that are transferred to the trust at the date of creation. That's the general rule. The exception is if there's U.S. beneficiaries at the time of creation or when they come in and then it's deemed to be distributed, that it becomes a grantor trust for the grantor until the earlier of the death of the grantor, or there's no longer any U.S. beneficiaries.
Yeah, they move away.
Basically, they move away, and then this deemed sale occurs as well. So even though it's out for estate and gift, income tax is an issue.
And it's a very interesting issue because if we have, for instance, a U.S. person who funds a foreign trust for asset protection purposes, and we have U.S. beneficiaries, just a standard, U.S. person with a family, it's deemed grantor because we've got the U.S. beneficiaries. And the tricky part of it is when the grantor dies, that's when the deemed sale occurs. But there's no gain. The deemed sale is a non-issue if, in fact, the assets were contributed as an incomplete gift. So if the assets remained in this U.S. person's estate, right? And they died.
And they're pulled back in, right, at death. Right.
Yeah, then they died. It's a deemed sale, but there was a step up in basis, and there's no gain. There's no impact on the deemed sale. The tricky part on these foreign to foreign, in other words, a foreign individual to a foreign trust, has now removed those assets from estate and gift tax, which is great. But if they come in the 5 years, now they're U.S. and the IRS says, okay, you come in, you've got U.S. beneficiaries. Typically, you'll have a U.S. beneficiary. We're going to wait. We're not going to hit you with the deemed sale. We know you've contributed as of the day you entered now. We're going to deem you to have contributed. But because you've got the U.S. beneficiaries, we're going to wait until you die to trigger the deemed sale. So, what's the answer?
Well, I think on the next slide we have more of the rules here. But the answer is, if you have a non-resident, non-citizen who's created this, the answer is, when they die, you want to make sure that it's no longer a foreign trust for income taxes. It's been domesticated.
Yes, we've never heard anyone articulate the process. So we've got a couple more rules on the next page, which says foreign trusts.
Unlike a U.S. person who has done one of these foreign trusts for asset protection purposes, on the foreign side, you're doing this to get these assets out of the estate tax net. And by preparing and creating and funding a foreign trust before coming in, you've done that. They've accomplished that goal. The issue is avoiding this deemed sale at death. That's the key. And the way to do that is to either decant or to transfer the situs of this foreign trust to a U.S. jurisdiction state before death.
And it doesn't bring the assets in for estate and gift tax purposes.
Right.
It's kind of the answer. The IRS is okay with it as long as you bring it into the state.
Right. And depending on the state you utilize, obviously in our state, in Florida, a trust can exist for 360 years. In South Dakota, it's unlimited, at least right now. So, I mean, these assets now, yes, the trust will be exposed to U.S. income tax on income because it's domesticated. But on the estate tax side and gift side, those assets and the GST side, they're out and exempt forever.
You've succeeded in the process.
Yes.
If you have a question, just put the question bar. We're not seeing your screen. And Tony will send us a question on that, or if you have any questions in general, you just call Brian or Gary, and we can walk through the process. But that's kind of the process where we get it out into the trust. They bring in what they're comfortable with, right? And then we domesticate the trust to avoid the deemed sale at death.
So on the next page, we start getting into, so that's the basic step to get things out. Now, the majority of clients who are coming in do not want to give up all their assets. They don't want to do that. They want to have control. They want to have wealth. They want to be able to live their life. And so they're going to bring some stuff in. It's just the way it is. So the question is, they have to decide during this process, okay, I'm going to do X. I'm going to plan, get these things out. We're going to go through the roadmap that we just discussed. But these other assets and wealth, we're going to bring in because we want to live and have, maintain our lifestyle. Mm-hmm. So they're going to come in with stuff. So what are we going to do with that? Well, once they're U.S. residents,
we get the credit.
Right, you get the credit, and then you have the ability to utilize domestic style, tax plan that we've always used for U.S. residents and folks that are already here. So it's a double sided. It's a mirror. It's both sides. You plan before you come in to get stuff out, the foreign stuff out, and then the stuff that they bring in, they can still live on it, they can still enjoy it, but then there are techniques we're able to utilize to lower it to basically where they avoid the estate tax on the stuff they...
And we monetize it, and as part of the monetization, which makes people very comfortable actually, we have strategies. And right. And the gifting strategy, for instance, we're going to go through two basic gifting strategies. One would be the grantor retained annuity. It's interesting we're moving from foreign trusts, 679, 684, shoot me in the head, to now we're looking at a grad.
You know, right.
Now they're domestic.
Well, I mean, from how the CPAs in the line, there's also all the compliance with the foreign trust. They have all those forms. So we've got another seminar on that, just on that. But yeah, so we've gone from one side, which is one thing. You have the interaction between the income and the estate on the foreign side, and then now on the domestic side, we have these time-tested techniques. Right. You know, in the grad especially, I mean, it's actually in the code.
So a lot of times with the grad, it's a gift and it's a retained annuity, and the retained annuity allows you to reduce substantially the value of the taxable gift or utilize your credit, etc. And that's really all they're looking for. They're just looking for a monthly internal cash transfer. You know, so let's say someone's wealthy and they want $100,000 a month, but they bring in $12 million. Well, they can get their grad gift way down in terms of the actual value of the assets gifted. If you retain the annuity, you can get that value of that gift for gift tax purposes way down. We only have a few minutes, so you can work through some of these advantages and
so on the next slide, on slide 18, just understand with the grad, it's based on a term of years. It can't exceed 20 years, and you can't die during the term. If you die during the term of the grad, it pulls it back into the annuity term. So just keep that in mind. And it might be an issue of the health and age of the individual, but that's definitely a great technique to where they can still maintain a monetary annuity, but get stuff out on the domestic side.
Here's the zeroed out. We do go through it in the slide.
Right.
That means that you've retained so much of an annuity that the actual gift is basically zero, right, in terms of the gift. You got to be careful, because what happens is the grad historically is to get out assets that are going to appreciate. You keep a cash annuity, and the appreciation and the actual underlying asset remains outside of your taxable estate.
So,
but if you're not going to spend it, then you're creating an estate. So you got to be careful. The annuity is too big. What do I do with the extra? This is for you to spend, because we're not trying to create an estate with the annuity, proceeds.
So then moving to slide 20.
So we have a question here. So do you have any questions or like a sheet or something that a green card holder needs to address, like a checklist before becoming a U.S. citizen, like any kind of reference material?
We typically would send a questionnaire out at that point, because it really depends on the level of the wealth, what kind of business assets they have, where they're at in terms of how many years they've had the green card. I know that sounds silly, but it's not. There's an issue on how many years you've had the green card. And so we'd send that out. Just send us your information. We'll send you a confidential questionnaire, and then we would do a complimentary overview of what strategies you should pursue.
Okay. We'll go to the next slide here.
Hey. Yeah, so we're on slide 20 now.
20 now, okay.
Yeah, we're going to move to 20 now because we're running out of time. Just so, as we're discussing here, these are all the strategies that are going to take place after they're here. So we talked about the grad. The other great technique that is still available as of now is the sale to an intentionally defective grantor trust. And this has been around, I think, since the 80s. But it's not in the code, unlike the grad.
It's similar to a grad.
But the idea is the same. The interest rates right now are extremely low. And the idea being that you come up with an amount of assets, either it can be an entity like a holding company or something, and then since you create an irrevocable grantor trust, so the person who creates the trust itself is ignored, disregarded for income taxes, but not for estate and gift. So the idea being that they would transfer at least 10% of the seed money, the purchase price of whatever asset they're going to buy, hopefully at a discount, because you've got to analyze and stuff. And then in return, they get an interest-only balloon note for a period of time with interest-only payments. And then over time, there's a liquidation event or something, and they can pay off the note in 7 to 8 years, but all the appreciation is outside of the estate, and they're still getting back the return of principal of the
It's
sale.
similar to the grad. Sometimes we use both strategies because in light of the instability of the law now, we don't know what's going to survive, but both are very, very good. And the last thing we wanted to add before we have a
on
few
slide
minutes
21.
left, slide 21, Tony, is the QPR, which is the Qualified Personal Residence Trust. A lot of times this is really a no-brainer. Many clients have a number of houses. You can use your principal residence, or you can use
One
a
vacation.
vacation house, and you put the house into the QPR, which is a trust, and it's the same idea as the grant. You retain a number of years that you have to outlive. So typically it'd be a 10-year term where you put in $1 million house, you keep 10-year term, and all of a sudden your $1 million gift becomes, a $500,000 gift. You just saved $500,000 in gift and estate tax, and it works like a charm. You can swap the house, you can sell the house, it's fantastic. The only problem is after the term ends, you have to pay your kids rent, which is just another gift.
Another gift,
Some people, we try to stay away from the word rent.
Yeah, I don't like that idea, but
they don't want to pay the kids rent.
So lastly, if we go to slide 24, do we just have some advantages, disadvantages for these different techniques? They have the GRAT there, and we've discussed it all, but basically, there are pluses and minuses to all these strategies, and so it has to be tailored to the client. What are they comfortable with? What do they want to do? And the same on slide 25, which is the QPR. It's the same thing, just that it really depends on the client, their health, their age, and then what they're comfortable with giving up control to.
Exactly. So now you know what we know. You can take someone as a non-resident alien all the way through the immigration process and do domestic planning and reduce. We have estates from 10 to $500 or $600 million down substantially, and really help people through the process. You really can be a value added to. This is one of the areas we really like, because we really can be a value added. Thanks so much.
Thank you.